Hey seniors, this is Mr. Evans. This is government class. Today in this video, in this asynchronous lesson, we're going to talk about the concept of federalism. Now, federalism is a very, very important concept in our system. Some people, especially down south, call it states' rights. So this isn't just like some abstraction, right? This is one of the reasons why the South ultimately waged the Civil War. Well, they waged it, to defend slavery, but they argued that it's our state's right to kind of have whatever institutions we want. And then later on, they used that argument to basically, justify, their treatment of black people. Also, a lot of conservatives have used the states' rights argument to justify their opposition to a lot of social programs that the federal government passes, saying they belong to their state responsibilities like healthcare, education, things like that. This is a very, very important topic. This isn't like just some abstract constitutional thing. This is something that is deeply felt in the minds of and hearts of a lot of Americans. The idea that the states, and in their mind, the people, should be supreme over the federal government, which they feel, states' rights proponents, is too distant from the people. So this argument goes back to the founding of our country. There were a lot of people in the United States in the early days who really believed that the idea of a strong federal government is a threat to the people's rights. Therefore, we need the states to have a lot of authority. In fact, that was one of the big reasons why a lot of people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution did so, because they believed that the Constitution gave the federal government too much authority. Now, when the Constitution was written, it attempted to balance the powers of the federal government with the powers held by the states. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind, like why America cares so much about the idea of states' rights, is because the United States had a very bad experience with a tyrannical central government, like the one we had with Britain. So that experience was seared in the minds of a lot of early Americans. So a lot of people said we have to make sure we do whatever we can to make sure that a central government in the United States can never get as powerful as a central government did in Britain. Now, federalism became a key component of the ultimate Constitution when it was written. Federalism is the sharing of power between the federal government and state governments. Now, just to give you some idea, like internationally, Canada, Australia, Germany, they all have a federal system of government as well. Like Canada has provinces, Australia has states, Germany has states. So they have states and they have a federal government. Other countries like the United Kingdom, Britain, France, Italy, Japan have unitary governments, meaning we had one central government in those countries that basically runs the affairs for the whole country. There's local governments in the sense like cities have mayors and city councils and things like that, but there are no state equivalents in those countries. That's kind of interesting because we wrote the Japanese Constitution after the Second World War. So it's a little interesting that they have a very different system of government than we do. Now, the Articles of Confederation had given enormous authority to the states. And that was one of the reasons why the Articles of Confederation was not working. The Articles of Confederation described the states basically as a, quote, firm league of friendship. So, they're with a very weak central government. So it was basically the states had most of the authority. And the central government was so weak, it really didn't have the power to do much of anything. But there are national priorities that need to be addressed, even if you believe in strong states. Regulating commerce between the states, building roads, coining money, defending the country. Like those are things that are national priorities, and a lot of the founding fathers argue that it's the only way you're ever going to have a functioning country is if you have a federal government that deals with these concerns. Now, Article 1 of the Constitution gives priority to the powers of Congress and the federal government. They define certain crimes, like certain things are defined specifically as federal crimes, like counterfeit, mail fraud, immigration laws. That's particularly the province of the federal government in the Constitution. The full faith and credit clause of the Constitution says states must honor the laws of other states. That's a very important concept. The Privileges and Immunities Clause says that each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the other states. So you can't have certain rights in one state and not have those rights in another state. And that issue came up with the whole debate over gay marriage. Like some states were allowing gay marriage while other states did not. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said that gay marriage was a constitutional right, but they didn't cite any of those clauses. They actually cited the Equal Protection Clause, which said that you can't treat married couples differently because, they happen to be of the same gender, or as opposed to opposite gender. So they didn't find it for that reason, but the whole full faith and credit clause and the privileges and immunity clause, they didn't legalize gay marriage for those reasons. But the thing is, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that actually would be a solid argument that, you can't have a marriage in Vermont between a gay couple that's not recognized in Mississippi. If someone from Vermont wanted to go down to Mississippi for a gay couple wanted to do that for some reason. Now, states generally cannot give priority to their own residents. Like they can treat people who live in their state differently than people who don't live in their state. The one exception is state colleges. Like, as you guys will see, when you're entering the college application process, states can give lower tuition to residents of their own state. And the reason why that is legal is because the argument is that, well, if you're a resident of the state, you pay taxes in that state. So therefore you should benefit with lower tuition in a state college, as opposed to somebody who lives in another state, and doesn't pay taxes into that state. There's an extradition clause in the Constitution. If you're like accused of a crime in Indiana, but you run away to Kentucky, Kentucky has to hand you back to Indiana. Otherwise people would just run to different states if they're accused of crimes. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says that federal laws are always supreme over state laws, ultimately. Now, before the Constitution was, and that's very important, right? Because that's basically what makes us a country, right? That if there's a conflict between two state laws, the federal law comes in. Or if there's a conflict between a state law and a federal law, it's the federal law that's ultimately is supreme over state laws. That's certainly something that's totally against the spirit of the Articles of Confederation, but the government would be unworkable without it. Now, before the Constitution was written, states already had powers. A lot of powers that the framers of the Constitution decided should stay with the states. Prisons. Most prisons are operated by the states because most crimes are state crimes. Like almost every crime you can think of, murder, rape, robbery, assault, all those things are state crimes. There are certain crimes that are specifically federal crimes, the federal things that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but then later on, the federal government made kidnapping, for instance, a federal crime, bank robbery, a federal crime. So those offenses can be, you can be punished by the federal government, but the overwhelming majority of crimes are state crimes, which is something to keep in mind when we have this debate about criminal justice reform on the federal level, how much that's really going to impact people who are in jail, because most people who are in jail are in state prisons for violations of state crimes. That's something to keep in mind. If a lot of us who want criminal justice reform also have to focus on states as well as the federal government. Management of elections. This is something that's certainly going to come up big time in this year, in the next few weeks. States run elections. Even if they're federal elections, the states are the one, like for Congress or for president, the states are in charge of actually running the machinery of the election, which, sometimes is problematic because different states have different standards for what votes count. Some different states have different laws in terms of who can vote, whether you have to have a photo ID, whether you can early vote, whether you can mail-in vote, all those things. So one of the big reasons why we're having all these debates today about all ballots and whether they count or not is because states run elections. So the thing is that if a state runs an election, they can basically run the election, however they want with all their different rules and regulations. Maintenance of records. That's done by the states. So like marriage, marriage records, birth records, death certificates, things like that, that you do not write the federal government Washington to see if you want a copy of your marriage license or you want a copy of, your grandfather's death certificate. You have to contact local authorities. Marriage laws are a state responsibility. So like if you get married, and the laws of marriage, they used, for example, you used to have to take a blood test before you got married. Things like that. How old you have to be married. Whether you need your parents' permission if you're underage. Divorce laws, things like that. That's handled by the states, not the federal government. Now, a lot of people who are a lot of the anti-federalists and a lot of people were skeptical of the ratification of the new Constitution. They were very concerned that the federal government that was being established was going to have way too much authority, that the states would actually be, the states which they believed were closer to the people. They believed that they would lose a lot of their authority in this new constitutional structure. So the 10th Amendment, which is the last of the Bill of Rights, and Bill of Rights, remember, is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The 10th Amendment specifically says that states' rights will be protected, that all powers not specifically granted to the federal government belong to the states and to the people. So that was put in there in order to kind of calm down a lot of people who were very concerned about whether the federal government was going to have too much authority. Now, another power that states have generally, police powers. We talked a little about it, a minute ago. States have the authority to create and enforce laws. States have very different laws, right? For example, if you want to be a lawyer, right, the bar exam in New York is very different than the bar exam in California. When I used to want to be a lawyer, and I didn't know if I was going to stay in New York, and I was thinking about living in California or Hawaii, and those laws are very, very different. Like a third of the entire California bar exam, for example, includes water law, questions about water law. So states have different laws, and that's fine. That's the way that our system is constructed. So some things are actually, penalties are much stricter in other states, one state than another. Some things are illegal in one state but aren't illegal in another state. So states have the ability to create their own laws and enforce their own laws. So laws on health and safety are generally state responsibilities, even though the federal government, particularly after the progressive era, began implementing more laws impacting health and safety and wages. But a lot of conservative types who really believed in the whole principle of states' rights found that problematic, because they said, well, does the federal government really have the authority to be intruding over areas that historically have belonged to the states? Education. That's another very big one. Education is almost entirely a state and local responsibility. So, for example, the federal government only provides 7% of the funding for schools. And that's only been since 1965. Before that, the federal government provided next to no funding for schools because public education was generally seen as a responsibility of the states. And it still generally is. States have very different requirements for what kids have to learn, what the graduation requirements are, what subjects they have to take, you name it. States basically still run schools. So yet another reason why it's important to not just focus on the presidency and Congress, but also focus on who's your governor, who's your state legislator, things like that, positions like that, because they actually impact a lot of your day-to-day life more than federal officials do, because they're dealing with health and safety and law enforcement and issues like that. Now, there are different types of powers in the Constitution for the states and for the federal government. There are powers known as delegated powers. Delegated powers or expressed powers are given specifically to the federal government. So the Constitution says these powers, we'll talk about what they are in a minute, these powers specifically belong to the federal government. There are reserved powers. Reserved powers is any power not given specifically to the federal government is reserved by the states. So unless the federal government specifically given the authority to do something, the state has the authority to do it. Even though one way around that is, well, two things, is one, the necessary and proper clause, which says that the federal government can do whatever is necessary and proper to actually to run the government, and also the power that the federal government has to regulate interstate commerce. That's pretty broad. So the thing is that the federal government could argue almost anything as interstate commerce, right? If I make a shirt like in Indiana, and I'm having a thing with Indiana today. If you make a shirt in Indiana and then I sell it to somebody in New Jersey in a store, that's interstate commerce. So it's a pretty broad power. So it's a pretty broad way that the federal government has of overriding the whole reserve powers principle, and conservatives don't like that too much. There are concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by both the federal and the state governments. Collecting taxes. You'll see this when you get a job. You have to pay both federal taxes and state taxes, because both the states and the federal government have the authority to tax. Defining crimes. The states can define crimes. And most crimes, again, are state, but the federal government can also define crimes. The federal government can say specific things are federal offenses. That's why people wind up in prison. Some federal prisons. Sometimes the federal government actually takes over certain crimes that used to be state crimes. I gave you two examples, kidnapping and bank robbery, because that was such a big problem during the Great Depression, because people were broke and they were robbing banks and kidnapping rich people. They made those federal crimes. So specifically, organized crime, the mafia, the federal government passed laws specifically to go after the mafia because they felt that state laws were insufficient or were not being used to actually go after organized crime. So let's go into a little bit more detail about that. The sharing of powers. So the federal government has specific powers. The military. The U.S. military is a federal responsibility, right? Having an army and a navy. Even though you could make the case that there is some concurrent power there, because a state has the power to run a militia, to have a militia, right? The National Guard is a state militia. Every state has its own National Guard. So you could say that's an example of concurrent powers, even though the federal government ultimately is supreme over the National Guard. So the federal government can order that the National Guard go to war or join, if we're at war, or join the national the General National Army. Coining money. That's a specific responsibility of the federal government. During the Ours Confederation years, states were printing or coining their own money. So New Jersey had different money than New York. That's not a for instance. That actually was the case. So that's just not feasible, right? You can't have different money, in different states. Regulating trade, interstate commerce. That's a federal responsibility, because how can one state regulate trade if you're selling items or doing business in other states, right? Only the federal government would have the authority. Makes sense. Only the federal government would have the authority to do that. Declaring war. That's a federal responsibility. Congress can be the only one to declare war. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military. So these delegated powers, the power to declare war, the power to coin money, the power to tax, to regulate interstate commerce, and immigration laws. We haven't really talked about that, but immigration laws were specifically, that's a delegated power to the federal government, right? A state obviously cannot decide who comes into the country, right? Because you're not just, if you're, coming into the United States, you're not just coming to New York, you're coming into the United States, ultimately. So the United States government has the authority to set immigration laws, which, is something that maybe the federal government can get to next year, because our immigration laws are in dire need of improvement. I think both sides would agree with that, maybe for different reasons. State powers, schools, marriage, safety, and health are powers that belong to the states generally. So again, schools are run by the states. Generally, prisons are generally run by the states. And then the concurrent powers we talked about, which is the sharing powers that are shared between the state and the federal government. So regulating health. Incorporating companies and cities. Like if you want to form your own business, that's like you have to go to the state and they'll do it for you. Like the Secretary of State of every state is actually in charge of that kind of thing. If you, new cities, when they're created, the state has to. Cities are creations of the state, which is why the state of New York, the state government in Albany, has so much authority over New York City, because ultimately any city is a creation of a state. So the state government is supreme. Marriage, divorce, wills. That's a state responsibility, and of course, education. Now, one thing I really do have to mention is that this issue is, as abstract as it maybe seems, it is so important because it cuts to the heart of almost every other issue we discuss. A lot of in politics, a lot of times people, we debate over who has the authority to whether we should have universal health care, whether we should have more assistance for kids to go to college, whether we should rebuild our nation, whether we should build roads and bridges and highways and things like that. And you name it, almost any issue that we argue about domestically ultimately boils down in our political discourse to the issue of federalism. Conservatives generally believe that a lot of all these things I mentioned belong to the states because the federal government does not specifically give, the Constitution does not specifically give the federal government the authority to handle these matters. So they argue that it's not a concern of the federal government, while more liberal people generally feel that the federal government has to assume these powers, has to do these things because the states are not able or not willing to do them, and also federal supremacy clause, necessary and proper clause ultimately gives the federal government the authority over the states. So almost every issue we talk about between left and right, liberal and conservative, ultimately boils down to a debate over federalism. One thing that should be mentioned is oftentimes people are, some people who are more conservative minded, who just oppose the idea of the government being heavily involved, like in healthcare and education and, workplace safety and things like that. A lot of times, they give states' rights arguments because they believe that the states are less likely to actually pass laws for universal health care and for more generous public education, more regulations of business and things like that. So one of the reasons, I'm not doubting their sincerity, but one of the reasons, this is just common sense, that one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives actually favor, federalism or believe in federalism so strongly is because they believe that states are less likely to do some things than the federal government is. And also on a philosophical level, conservatives don't believe that the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to handle a lot of these matters. This is something that, has to be kept in mind by any aspiring liberal politicians who have a lot of bold initiatives they want to implement, but ultimately these things will be challenged in court by conservatives on federalism grounds. The federal government's passing a law that they don't have the authority to pass because only the states have the authority, and people interpret it very, very differently. But often it's through the filter of their own political ideology. All right, guys. So very good. So when I see you in live class on Monday, we'll continue talking about federalism and the impact practically it has on the history of it, and also the impact practically it has on the lives of people in this country. All right. So I'll see you on Monday. Peace.